My name is Dom Varga, and I was a SWAT officer in Detroit when the sky turned gray and never came back. In 30 days, I watched my city freeze solid, my team fall apart, and everything I knew about survival become useless. The volcanic eruption changed more than the weather. It changed what it meant to be human. I had to choose between following orders and keeping people alive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dom Varga, and I was a SWAT officer in Detroit when the sky turned gray and never came back. In 30 days, I watched my city freeze solid, my team fall apart, and everything I knew about survival become useless. The volcanic eruption changed more than the weather. It changed what it meant to be human. I had to choose between following orders and keeping people alive. 12 years ago, I joined the Detroit Police Department thinking I'd seen rock bottom. This city had already been through hell and back. Abandoned factories stretched for miles, whole neighborhoods looked like war zones, and the crime rate made national news for all the wrong reasons. But I grew up here in the Polish community on the east side, watched my old man lose his job when the auto plants closed, saw what happened when hope dies. I thought becoming a cop would let me make a difference, maybe save what was left of the place I called home. 6 years on SWAT, I thought I knew what chaos looked like. We'd kick down doors and crack houses where dealers kept assault rifles next to their kids' toys. I'd talked suicidal veterans off rooftops in January snowstorms. My team had cleared buildings where gang members used homeless people for target practice. We operated in neighborhoods where ambulances needed police escorts just to pick up bodies. Detroit had taught me that humans could sink pretty low, but I believed we could always climb back up if someone was willing to fight for what was right. The morning of October 9th started like any other day. I was 3 weeks into my rotation, which meant early mornings and late nights. My alarm went off at 5:30, same as always. Coffee, quick workout in my basement, check the news while I got dressed. The weather guy was talking about some atmospheric disturbance affecting air traffic over the Atlantic. Nothing that seemed relevant to a SWAT officer in Michigan. International news always felt distant when you were dealing with domestic problems that needed immediate attention. My team met at the precinct at 7 o'clock for morning briefing. Sergeant Chun went through the usual roster of warrants we needed to serve, intelligence reports on gang activity, and requests for assistance from other departments. Detroit was having one of its quieter weeks, which in our line of work meant we might actually get to eat lunch without getting called to a hostage situation. Martinez was complaining about his overtime hours. Johnson was showing off pictures of his new daughter, and Rodriguez was planning his weekend fishing trip to Lake Huron. Normal cop talk about normal cop problems. Our first call came in around 9:15. Elementary school on the west side. Kids having breathing problems. The principal thought it might be a gas leak or some kind of chemical spill from one of the abandoned factories nearby. We rolled out expecting to find drug lab fumes or industrial contamination. Detroit had plenty of both, and schools unfortunately got hit by environmental problems on a regular basis. The city's infrastructure was old, and safety regulations weren't always followed in the neighborhoods where people couldn't afford to move somewhere cleaner. When we arrived at the school, I noticed something strange right away. The sky looked different. Not cloudy exactly, but gray in a way I'd never seen before. Like someone had put a filter over the sun. The air smelled metallic, almost like pennies. And there was this fine dust settling on everything. Cars, sidewalks, playground equipment, all covered in what looked like gray snow, except it wasn't cold enough for snow. The principal met us at the front entrance, clearly worried, but trying to stay calm for the kids. She explained that about an hour earlier, children started coughing during morning recess. First just a few in the younger grades, then more and more across all age groups. The school nurse had checked for fever, allergic reactions, anything that might explain why healthy kids were suddenly having trouble breathing. Some were wheezing, others complained their throats felt scratchy. A few were coughing up gray phlegm. The principal had called the fire department first, thinking it might be smoke from a building fire, but they couldn't locate any source of combustion in the area. We spent 2 hours at that school, checking air quality, interviewing staff, trying to figure out what was making children sick. The fire department brought their air monitoring equipment, and the readings were unusual but not immediately dangerous. High levels of particulates in the atmosphere, but nothing that should cause acute respiratory distress. The strange thing was that the dust kept falling. Even after we thought we'd identified the source as atmospheric debris, more kept settling on surfaces. It wasn't stopping. Rodriguez mentioned that his grandmother had called that morning from Puerto Rico, complaining about strange weather there too. Gray skies, unusual ash falling, temperatures dropping unexpectedly. He'd assumed she was exaggerating like grandmothers do, but now he was starting to wonder if there was a connection. Martinez said his cousin in Chicago had posted something on social media about weird atmospheric conditions there as well. We were starting to see a pattern, but none of us understood what it meant yet. The radio chatter that day was different than usual. More calls about respiratory problems, heating system failures, unusual weather observations. Dispatch was fielding complaints from all over the metropolitan area about air quality, strange dust accumulation, and requests for wellness checks on elderly residents. The volume wasn't overwhelming, but the consistency was notable. Usually our emergency calls fell into predictable categories: domestic violence, property crimes, drug-related incidents, traffic accidents. This was something new. That afternoon, we got called to a break-in at the National Weather Service office downtown. Someone had smashed the front windows and scattered papers all over the parking lot. When we arrived, we found an elderly man sitting in the lobby, surrounded by charts and computer printouts. He wasn't trying to steal anything or cause damage. He was reading weather data and muttering to himself about patterns he recognized from decades of meteorological observation. The man turned out to be a retired forecaster who'd worked for the National Weather Service for 35 years. He kept talking about numbers that didn't make sense, atmospheric readings that defied normal patterns, temperature data from weather stations around the world showing simultaneous drops in regions that shouldn't be connected. The old man was clearly agitated, but he wasn't crazy. He knew what he was looking at, and what he was seeing scared him. He mentioned something about volcanic activity affecting global weather patterns, sulfur dioxide in the upper atmosphere, and historical precedents that had caused famines and social collapse. I should have listened more carefully to what he was saying. Should have asked more questions about those numbers he kept referencing. Should have taken the time to understand why a man with 35 years of weather forecasting experience was breaking into his former workplace to access data that he felt was too important to ignore. Instead, we treated it like a standard trespassing case, made sure he wasn't a danger to himself or others, and filed a report that probably got buried in paperwork that nobody ever read. The temperature dropped 8 degrees that night. 8 degrees in 12 hours. I remember checking my thermometer before bed and again when I woke up, thinking there had to be some mistake. October nights in Detroit could be cool, but we didn't usually see that kind of dramatic change without a major weather front moving through. The morning news mentioned the temperature drop, but attributed it to seasonal variation and the unusual atmospheric conditions caused by what they were now calling a significant volcanic eruption in the mid-Atlantic ridge. Day 3 brought more of the gray dust, which the news was now identifying as volcanic ash carried by high-altitude winds. The ash was settling on everything, coating cars and buildings with a fine layer of grit that tasted metallic when you accidentally breathed it in. People were wearing masks, not because of any official recommendation, but because breathing was becoming uncomfortable. The dust got into everything. Your eyes, your clothes, your food if you left it uncovered. It was like living in a city that was slowly being buried. We responded to more calls that day about heating system failures. Furnaces clogged with ash, air conditioning units breaking down from the particulate load. Elderly residents calling for welfare checks because their apartments were getting too cold. The emergency room at Detroit Medical Center reported an increase in respiratory admissions, mostly children and older adults with pre-existing conditions. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but a clear trend that was starting to strain medical resources. I remember talking to an old-timer at the precinct that afternoon, Officer Williams, who'd been working Detroit streets for 40 years. He mentioned that his grandfather used to tell stories about the year without summer, sometime back in the 1800s when volcanic activity changed weather patterns globally. Crops failed, people starved, governments fell because they couldn't feed their populations. Williams said his grandfather always claimed that natural disasters could end civilizations faster than wars or disease, but people forgot those lessons because they happened so rarely that nobody alive remembered the last time. The fourth day brought our first fatalities. 3 elderly residents found dead in their apartments, apparently from hypothermia. Hypothermia in October in Detroit. The medical examiner's preliminary reports indicated that all 3 had been in relatively good health, living independently, with functioning heating systems. But the combination of unusual cold, respiratory stress from the ash, and possibly some underlying health conditions had been enough to kill them. These weren't homeless people dying on the streets. These were grandmothers and grandfathers dying in their own homes, because the weather had changed too fast for their bodies to adapt. That night, Martinez mentioned that his grandmother in Puerto Rico had called again. She was scared because the temperature there had dropped 15 degrees in 3 days, and people were talking about crop damage from unusual frost. Puerto Rico doesn't get frost. Martinez was starting to worry that whatever was happening wasn't limited to the northern United States. His grandmother had lived through hurricanes, earthquakes, political upheaval, economic collapse. She wasn't easily frightened, but she was frightened now. The 5th day brought the first major snowfall. 3 feet of snow in October. I'd lived in Detroit my entire life, seen plenty of early winter storms, but nothing like this. The snow was heavy and wet, mixed with the volcanic ash, creating a gray slush that clogged storm drains and made driving nearly impossible. The city's snow removal equipment wasn't prepared for this kind of accumulation this early in the season. Most of the plows were still in storage, waiting for their usual December deployment. Emergency services were overwhelmed. 911 calls increased by 300%, mostly requests for medical assistance, welfare checks, and people trapped in their vehicles. The combination of unexpected weather, reduced visibility from the ash, and road conditions that nobody was prepared for created a perfect storm of emergency situations. Our SWAT team was being deployed for rescue operations instead of tactical situations, pulling people out of abandoned cars and checking on residents who hadn't been heard from since the temperature drop began. I started noticing changes in animal behavior around this time. Birds that should have been preparing for normal seasonal migration were leaving the city in massive flocks, all heading south in patterns that didn't match their usual routes. Even the pigeons that lived year-round in downtown Detroit were abandoning their roosts and building ledges and bridge supports. Stray cats that normally stayed in their territorial areas were moving constantly, like they were searching for something they couldn't find. Dogs were restless, whining at their owners, refusing to go outside even for necessary walks. The wildlife behavior bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Animals have instincts that humans have lost, senses that detect changes in the environment before we understand what's happening. When creatures that have adapted to urban life start abandoning their territories, It usually means they're sensing danger that we haven't recognized yet. I'd seen similar behavior before major storms, but this was different. This felt like evacuation rather than preparation. Day 6 brought power grid problems. Not complete failures yet, but rolling blackouts and voltage irregularities that suggested the electrical system was under unusual strain. The combination of increased heating demand, equipment problems caused by ash infiltration, and infrastructure that was already aging created a perfect storm of technical difficulties. Detroit Edison issued statements about working to maintain reliable service, but their tone suggested they were struggling with problems they hadn't anticipated. The emergency radio traffic that day included more references to similar conditions in other cities. Chicago, Minneapolis, Cleveland, Buffalo, all reporting unusual weather, infrastructure problems, and increased emergency response needs. It wasn't just northern cities anymore. We were getting reports from Nashville, Louisville, even Atlanta about unexpected temperature drops and unusual atmospheric conditions. Whatever was happening was spreading south faster than anyone had predicted. That evening, I found myself thinking about the retired weatherman we'd encountered at the National Weather Service office. His agitation made more sense now. If he'd been seeing data that predicted what we were experiencing, his urgency was completely justified. I wished I'd taken the time to understand what he was trying to tell us. Maybe if I'd listened more carefully, asked better questions, we would have been better prepared for what was coming. The numbers I'd glimpsed on those scattered charts and printouts were starting to haunt me. Temperature readings, atmospheric measurements, data from weather stations around the world. I didn't understand meteorology well enough to interpret what I'd seen, but I remembered enough to know that the patterns were global and the changes were accelerating. Whatever had started with a volcanic eruption in the mid-Atlantic was affecting weather systems everywhere, and the people who understood these things had been trying to warn us. I should have paid more attention to those numbers. Maybe then, I would have been ready for what came next. Day 7 changed everything. I woke up at 5:30 like always, but when I looked outside my bedroom window, I couldn't see my neighbor's house. The world had disappeared under 15 more inches of snow overnight, and the temperature had dropped another 12 degrees. My outdoor thermometer read 8 degrees below zero. In October, the mathematical impossibility of what I was seeing should have prepared me for how impossible everything else was about to become. The snow wasn't normal either. Mixed with volcanic ash, it had this gray color that made everything look like an old black and white photograph. But more disturbing was how heavy it was. This wasn't the light, fluffy snow we usually got early in the season. This was the dense, wet snow that brought down power lines and collapsed roofs. Combined with the ash particles, it stuck to everything and refused to blow away in the wind. It was accumulating faster than it could melt or disperse. I tried to start my patrol car, and the engine turned over reluctantly. The cold was affecting everything mechanical. My radio crackled with static worse than usual, and when I finally got clear communication with dispatch, the volume of emergency calls was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The entire 911 system was overwhelmed. Hold times were over 20 minutes for non-life-threatening calls, and even Priority 1 calls were being delayed because there weren't enough units available to respond. The drive to the precinct took 3 times longer than normal. Cars abandoned everywhere, some buried so deep in the gray snow that only their antennas were visible. Traffic lights were malfunctioning due to power fluctuations, and the few drivers who were still attempting to navigate the roads were sliding through intersections without any ability to control their vehicles. I counted 12 accidents just on my normal route, and those were only the ones I could see through the reduced visibility. When I arrived at the precinct, half the building was without heat. The furnace system had been overwhelmed by the sudden temperature drop and was cycling on and off irregularly. Officer Williams was wearing his winter coat inside the building, and his breath was visible when he spoke. The coffee in the break room had a thin layer of ice on top. We were losing the basic infrastructure that kept a police station functional. And if we couldn't maintain our own facilities, how were we supposed to help the community? Morning briefing was chaos. Sergeant Chun looked like he hadn't slept, and the incident reports from overnight filled 3 times the usual number of pages. Welfare checks on elderly residents had revealed 17 more deaths from hypothermia. 17 people had died in their own homes because the temperature had changed too fast for human physiology to adapt. These weren't people living on the margins of society. These were retirees with pensions, homeowners with functioning heating systems, people who should have been safe inside their own houses. The emergency room at Detroit Medical Center had reached capacity and was diverting patients to suburban hospitals that were also filling up fast. Respiratory cases had increased by 400%, mostly from people breathing the ash-contaminated air, but hypothermia cases were climbing even faster. The hospital was treating frostbite injuries in people who had been outside for less than 30 minutes. The human body wasn't designed to handle this kind of sudden environmental change. Rodriguez wasn't at briefing. His wife had called to say he was stuck at home because his street hadn't been plowed and his car wouldn't start in the cold. 3 other officers were missing for similar reasons. Our effective force was reduced by almost 30%, just when emergency calls were increasing exponentially. We were losing personnel to the same environmental conditions that were creating the emergencies we needed to respond to. The radio chatter was different that morning too. Instead of the usual mix of routine calls and criminal activity, almost everything was weather-related. People trapped in cars, heating emergencies, medical calls related to exposure, requests for welfare checks on neighbors who hadn't been seen since the temperature dropped. But more concerning were the references to similar conditions in other cities. Chicago was reporting the same problems. Minneapolis was asking for state assistance. Cleveland had declared a local emergency. But it wasn't just northern cities anymore. The dispatcher mentioned a call from Nashville requesting information about cold weather emergency protocols. Nashville, Tennessee was asking Detroit, Michigan, for advice about dealing with extreme cold. That's when I started to understand that whatever we were dealing with wasn't a regional weather event. This was something much bigger. Our first call that day took us to Interstate 75, where a multi-vehicle accident had trapped dozens of commuters in their cars. The highway department hadn't been able to get plows out because the snow was too deep and falling too fast. Cars were buried up to their windows, and people had been sitting in traffic for over 6 hours with their engines running, trying to stay warm. Some had run out of gas. Others had carbon monoxide poisoning from exhaust fumes that couldn't disperse in the still air. When we arrived at the scene, I realized we were looking at something unprecedented. This wasn't a typical winter storm response. This was a mass casualty event caused by weather conditions that had never occurred before in recorded history. The Michigan State Police were coordinating with the National Guard to bring in heavy equipment, but even military vehicles were having trouble moving through the accumulation. We spent 4 hours pulling people out of cars, treating hypothermia and carbon monoxide exposure, coordinating evacuations to warming centers that were already overcrowded. I watched a grandmother die in her car seat while we were cutting through the roof to extract her family. She was maybe 65 years old, probably someone's favorite person in the world, and she died because she tried to drive to work on a Tuesday morning in October. The randomness of it was devastating. During the rescue operation, Martinez mentioned that his cousin in Chicago had posted updates on social media about similar highway disasters there. Cars trapped on the Dan Ryan Expressway, people dying of exposure in traffic jams, emergency services overwhelmed by simultaneous mass casualty events. The same thing was happening in multiple cities at the same time. The infrastructure that supported millions of people was failing simultaneously across a geographic area that spanned multiple states. That afternoon, while we were still working the highway incident, I noticed something that made my blood cold. The Detroit River was starting to freeze. Not just ice forming at the edges like you'd see in January. The entire river was developing a solid surface, and you could hear it happening. The ice was expanding and contracting, creating sounds like gunshots or thunder, but constant and rhythmic. Chunks of ice the size of cars were colliding and jamming up against the bridges. I'd lived in Detroit my entire life. I'd seen the river freeze before during especially harsh winters, but never this fast and never this early. The Detroit River connects Lake Huron to Lake Erie, carrying massive volumes of water that don't freeze easily. For it to be developing solid ice in October meant the temperature was dropping far below anything our region had experienced in recorded history. If the Great Lakes were freezing, the implications for weather patterns, shipping, and basic infrastructure were catastrophic. Rodriguez finally made it to work around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but he brought bad news. His street hadn't been plowed because the city's snow removal equipment was breaking down. The ash mixed with snow was clogging the machinery, and the extreme cold was causing hydraulic failures in equipment that wasn't designed to operate at these temperatures. If the city couldn't clear the roads, emergency services couldn't reach people who needed help. We were losing our ability to function as first responders. The news that evening was surreal. The Weather Service was calling it an unprecedented atmospheric event caused by volcanic activity, but their predictions kept being wrong. Every forecast underestimated how fast the temperature was dropping and how much snow was falling. The meteorologists were using phrases like historic and extraordinary, but they were clearly struggling to explain what was happening. Their computer models weren't designed to predict this kind of rapid environmental change. More disturbing were the reports from other regions. The volcanic ash cloud was spreading faster than anyone had predicted, and the temperature drops were occurring in areas that should have been unaffected. The emergency management officials were talking about temporary disruptions and recovery timelines, but their body language suggested they were dealing with something they didn't understand. The confident tone that usually characterized official disaster response was missing. Day 8 brought the moment I knew everything had changed. Forever, we were called to do a welfare check on residents of a senior living facility on the east side. The building's heating system had failed during the night, and several residents hadn't been accounted for during the morning check. When we arrived, we found that 12 people had died of hypothermia in their own beds. 12 human beings who had survived the Great Depression, World War II, the decline of Detroit, and decades of personal challenges had died because the weather changed too fast for their bodies to handle. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was standing in that building, looking at those people who had died peacefully in their sleep, and hearing the Detroit River making sounds I'd never heard before. The ice was expanding so rapidly that it was creating pressure waves you could feel through the building's foundation. Chunks of ice were piling up against the shore, creating formations that looked like small mountains. The river that had defined Detroit's geography for centuries was becoming something entirely different. I stood at the window of that senior facility, watching the Detroit River transform into a solid mass of ice, and I knew we weren't dealing with bad weather anymore. This was something else entirely. Something that was changing the fundamental characteristics of our environment in ways that human civilization wasn't prepared to handle. The people who had died in that building weren't victims of a storm. They were casualties of a planetary event that was rewriting the rules of survival. That night, the power grid failed across most of the metropolitan area. Not temporary outages or rolling blackouts, but complete system failure. The combination of increased demand, equipment failures from ash infiltration, and infrastructure damage from the unprecedented weather had pushed the electrical system beyond its capacity. Detroit Edison issued statements about working to restore service, but their repair crews couldn't operate in the extreme conditions. We were losing the energy infrastructure that powered heating systems, medical equipment, and communication networks. Without electricity, the city became a different place after dark. No street lights, no traffic signals, no illuminated signs or building lighting. The only light came from emergency vehicles and the occasional generator. But more significant was the silence. Without the constant hum of electrical systems, you could hear things that were usually masked by urban noise. You could hear the ice on the river expanding and contracting. You could hear trees cracking from the cold. You could hear the wind carrying volcanic ash against building walls like sandpaper. Day 9 brought our first real test as a SWAT team in these new conditions. We were called to assist with evacuations from a housing complex where the heating system failure had created life-threatening conditions for over 200 residents. Many were elderly or had medical conditions that required climate-controlled environments. They needed to be moved to warming centers, but transportation was nearly impossible due to road conditions and vehicle failures. The operation required us to coordinate with fire department rescue units, emergency medical services, and National Guard transportation assets. But our tactical training wasn't designed for mass evacuation under extreme weather conditions. We were used to controlled environments, precise timing, and equipment that functioned predictably. Everything we thought we knew about operational planning was being challenged by conditions that changed hourly. During the evacuation, we lost our first team member. Rodriguez volunteered to check the building's upper floors for residents who might have been missed during the initial sweep. The stairwell heating had failed, and the temperature inside the building was below freezing. When Rodriguez didn't report back within his assigned time frame, we went looking for him. We found him unconscious on the 4th floor, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. His radio had stopped working due to battery failure in the extreme cold. Rodriguez survived, but he required immediate medical evacuation and intensive treatment for cold-related injuries. A SWAT officer, someone trained for the most dangerous situations Detroit could produce, had been incapacitated by environmental conditions in less than 30 minutes. If we couldn't protect our own personnel, how could we protect the community we'd sworn to serve? The realization that our tactical gear and training might be inadequate for this new reality was terrifying. The radio traffic that day included more concerning developments. Emergency broadcasts were mentioning supply chain disruptions, food distribution problems, and transportation network failures. The infrastructure that supported modern life was breaking down simultaneously across multiple states. Grocery stores were running out of food because delivery trucks couldn't navigate the road conditions. Hospitals were running low on medical supplies because their normal shipping routes were impassable. But the most disturbing information came from emergency management officials discussing evacuation routes and temporary sheltering options. They were talking about moving people south, away from the affected areas, as if this was a localized disaster that could be escaped by relocating. The problem was that reports from southern cities suggested the environmental changes were spreading faster than people could move. There might not be anywhere to evacuate to. Day 10 brought the complete collapse of normal city services. The police department lost communication with over half of our patrol units due to radio system failures and personnel who couldn't reach their assignments. Fire department response times increased to over 2 hours for non-emergency calls. Emergency medical services were operating at less than 30% capacity because ambulances couldn't start in the extreme cold and paramedics were getting injured trying to operate in hazardous conditions. The National Weather Service office had stopped issuing regular forecasts because their computer models couldn't process the atmospheric data they were receiving. Instead, They were broadcasting general warnings about life-threatening conditions and recommendations to shelter in place. The scientific infrastructure that predicted weather and helped people prepare for environmental changes had been overwhelmed by the speed and severity of what was happening. That morning, we received our final official briefing from police headquarters. Sergeant Chun explained that the department was transitioning to emergency protocols, which meant abandoning routine law enforcement activities and focusing entirely on life safety operations. Property crimes, traffic violations, and most civilian complaints would not be investigated. Our only mission was to keep people alive until normal services could be restored. But Chun's tone suggested he didn't believe normal services would be restored anytime soon. He mentioned that state and federal emergency management agencies were describing the situation as unprecedented and were struggling to develop appropriate response strategies. The resources that usually supported disaster recovery were being overwhelmed by the geographic scope and intensity of what was occurring. We were essentially on our own. The headquarters building itself was becoming uninhabitable. The heating system was operating intermittently, and several offices had pipes that had frozen and burst, creating water damage and unsafe conditions. The evidence storage areas were experiencing temperature fluctuations that could compromise criminal cases. The detention facilities were too cold to safely hold prisoners. The basic infrastructure that supported law enforcement operations was failing. That afternoon, while we were attempting to respond to a medical emergency in a downtown office building, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of what we were facing. The emergency radio picked up a transmission from a survival group, claiming to have made contact with government officials. According to their report, federal agencies were acknowledging that the volcanic eruption had triggered atmospheric changes that could persist for months or years. They were discussing evacuation of northern cities and establishment of temporary settlements in warmer regions. The transmission suggested that government officials had known the severity of the situation earlier than they had publicly admitted, and that initial response strategies had been based on the assumption that conditions would return to normal within weeks. Now they were developing contingency plans for long-term displacement of populations and fundamental changes to how resources were distributed and communities were organized. The scope of what we were dealing with was beyond anything that modern emergency management had been designed to handle. Day 11 brought news that made everything else seem manageable by comparison. The radio intercepts included communications between federal agencies discussing something called Operation Deep Freeze, which appeared to be plans for systematic evacuation of northern territories and consolidation of population centers in southern regions. The communication suggested that government scientists had concluded that the environmental changes were permanent, and that large areas of the country would become uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. According to the intercepted communications, federal resources were being redirected towards southern cities and temporary settlement areas, while northern regions were being classified as non-sustainable. The implications were staggering. Millions of people were being written off as casualties of an environmental disaster that no one had predicted or prepared for. The government was planning to abandon half the country rather than attempt to maintain civilization under the new conditions. But the most devastating information was the timeline. According to the federal communications, the atmospheric changes were expected to continue for at least 2 to 3 years, with temperatures potentially dropping another 20 to 30 degrees below current levels. The volcanic ash in the upper atmosphere was blocking solar radiation more effectively than anyone had calculated, and the cooling effect was accelerating as ice coverage increased and reflected more sunlight back into space. If the government projections were accurate, we weren't dealing with a temporary emergency that would resolve with proper disaster response. We were witnessing the beginning of a new ice age that would fundamentally change human civilization. The infrastructure, agriculture, And social systems that supported modern life were not designed to function under these conditions. Everything we thought we knew about survival, community, and government was about to be tested in ways that no one alive had ever experienced. The numbers I glimpsed on those scattered charts at the National Weather Service office were starting to make terrible sense. The retired forecaster who'd broken into his former workplace had been trying to warn people about changes that would make normal life impossible. His agitation hadn't been the confusion of an elderly man. It had been the desperate urgency of someone who understood the magnitude of what was coming and knew that no one was listening. I should have paid more attention to what he was trying to tell us. Maybe then I would have been ready for what happened next. Day 12 marked the end of everything I thought I understood about being a police officer. We received our final communication from headquarters that morning, a crackling radio transmission that lasted less than 2 minutes. Sergeant Chun's voice was barely audible through the static, but his message was clear enough. The department was officially suspending normal operations. Officers were released from duty to focus on personal survival and family safety. We were told to retain our equipment and provide assistance to civilians when possible, but there would be no more coordinated law enforcement response to emergency calls. The precinct building had become uninhabitable overnight. Pipes had burst throughout the structure, flooding the basement where evidence and equipment were stored. The heating system had failed completely, and ice was forming on the interior walls. Without electricity to power the communication systems, we had no way to coordinate with other units or receive updates from emergency management agencies. The infrastructure that had supported law enforcement for decades was gone. Standing in that frozen police station, surrounded by equipment that no longer functioned and files that were turning into blocks of ice, I realized that everything I'd trained for was suddenly irrelevant. SWAT tactics were designed for controlled environments where you could predict how equipment would perform and criminals would behave. We operated based on the assumption that backup would be available, that medical support could be summoned, that the basic systems of civilization would continue functioning even during the most dangerous operations. But civilization had stopped functioning. The rules that governed police work, the protocols that kept officers safe, the chain of command that provided structure and support, all of it was gone. We were still carrying badges and wearing uniforms, but we were no longer police officers. In any meaningful sense, we were just people with tactical training trying to survive in a world that had become completely hostile to human life. Martinez was the first to acknowledge what we were all thinking. He said we needed to stop pretending we were still cops and start figuring out how to stay alive. His grandmother in Puerto Rico had stopped answering her phone 3 days earlier, and he was worried that the environmental changes had reached even the Caribbean islands. If this was truly a global catastrophe, then traditional law enforcement priorities like property protection and criminal investigation were luxuries that no one could afford anymore. Rodriguez, who had recovered enough from his hypothermia to return to limited duty, agreed that we needed to change our approach completely. He'd spent 2 days in the hospital, and the medical staff had told him things that weren't being reported in official communications. The emergency rooms were seeing injuries and illnesses that doctors had never encountered before. Frostbite cases in people who had been exposed to the cold for less than 15 minutes. Respiratory damage from volcanic ash that was more severe than anything caused by normal air pollution. Children dying from environmental exposure despite being inside heated buildings. The medical professionals were also dealing with supply shortages that were becoming critical. Medications for treating hypothermia and respiratory distress were running out because pharmaceutical companies couldn't maintain production facilities in the extreme conditions. Medical equipment was failing due to temperature extremes and power fluctuations. Hospitals were having to choose which patients to treat because they didn't have enough resources to save everyone who needed help. Johnson, who had been quiet During most of our discussion about abandoning police protocols, finally spoke up about something that had been bothering him since the power grid failed. He'd been monitoring emergency radio frequencies from his personal equipment at home, and he was hearing communications that suggested the government had been planning for this kind of catastrophe longer than they had publicly admitted. References to contingency plans, resource allocation strategies, and population management protocols that seemed too detailed to have been developed in response to the current crisis. According to the radio intercepts Johnson had been monitoring, federal agencies had been tracking the volcanic eruption's potential atmospheric effects from the beginning, and their initial public statements about temporary disruptions had been deliberately misleading. The scientific data that predicted long-term environmental changes had been available within days of the eruption, but officials had chosen to minimize the severity of the situation to prevent panic and maintain social order while they implemented their own survival strategies. The realization that our own government had knowingly misled the public about the scope of the disaster was devastating. We'd been risking our lives to maintain order and protect communities, based on the assumption that normal services would be restored once the immediate emergency passed. But if the federal agencies had known from the beginning that the environmental changes were permanent, then everything we'd been doing was pointless. We'd been trying to preserve a civilization that was already dead. Day 13 brought our first encounter with armed civilians who had organized themselves into survival groups. We were attempting to check on residents of a suburban neighborhood when we were confronted by a group of homeowners who had barricaded their streets and were preventing outsiders from entering their area. They had weapons, communication equipment, and what appeared to be a well-organized security system. They weren't criminals in the traditional sense, but they were clearly prepared to use violence to protect their resources. The encounter forced us to confront a fundamental question about our role in this new environment. These people weren't breaking any laws that still mattered. Property crimes and weapons violations were irrelevant when the government had abandoned its responsibility to provide basic services. They were doing what they needed to do to keep their families alive, but their actions were preventing us from reaching people who might need help, and their weapons posed a threat to anyone who didn't belong to their group. I tried to approach the situation using traditional police de-escalation techniques, identifying myself as a law enforcement officer, and explaining that we were conducting welfare checks on behalf of the city. But the group's leader, a middle-aged man who turned out to be a retired military officer, made it clear that they no longer recognized the authority of local law enforcement. As far as they were concerned, the police department had abandoned the community when the city stopped providing basic services, and they were now responsible for their own security. The conversation with the retired military officer was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. He explained that his group had been monitoring the same government communications that Johnson had been intercepting, and they had concluded that federal authorities were planning to abandon northern cities entirely. According to their analysis, resources were being redirected towards southern regions where temporary settlements were being established for displaced populations. Northern communities were being left to fend for themselves or die trying. But, more significantly, the retired officer told us about communications they had intercepted regarding something called Operation Deep Freeze, which apparently involved systematic evacuation of government personnel and essential resources from regions that were deemed non-sustainable. According to these communications, federal agencies were prioritizing the survival of key personnel and critical infrastructure over the general population. They were essentially implementing a triage system on a national scale, deciding which communities would receive support and which would be abandoned. The implications were staggering. If the government was planning to abandon entire regions, then local law enforcement, emergency services, and community leaders were wasting their time trying to maintain order and provide assistance, the resources we were using to help people survive. The immediate crisis could be better spent preparing for long-term survival in a world where government support would no longer be available. We needed to stop thinking like police officers and start thinking like survivors. That afternoon, we encountered our first civilian casualty directly caused by the breakdown of social order. An elderly woman had been robbed and left outside, in the cold, by someone who had taken her winter clothing and emergency supplies. She died of exposure before we could get her to medical help. This wasn't a death caused by the environmental disaster. This was a death caused by human predation against vulnerable people who couldn't defend themselves. The incident forced us to acknowledge that the collapse of law enforcement was creating opportunities for the worst kinds of human behavior. People who had been restrained by the threat of legal consequences were now free to take advantage of others without fear of punishment. The social contract that had maintained order was breaking down, and the most vulnerable members of the community were becoming targets for anyone willing to use violence to take what they needed. But the more disturbing realization was that traditional law enforcement responses weren't adequate for this new reality. We couldn't arrest someone for robbery when there were no functioning courts, no operating jails, and no prospect of resuming normal legal processes. We couldn't investigate crimes when we had no way to process evidence, no ability to conduct interviews, and no system for documenting cases. The entire framework of criminal justice had become irrelevant. Martinez suggested that we needed to start thinking about justice differently. Instead of trying to enforce laws that no longer mattered, we should focus on protecting people who couldn't protect themselves and deterring behavior that threatened community survival. This meant using our tactical training and equipment to provide security for vulnerable populations. But it also meant making decisions about life and death without the legal protections and oversight that had always guided police work. Day 14 brought an encounter that changed my understanding of leadership in this new world. We were approached by a group of civilians led by a woman named Sarah Chun, who turned out to be a former auto plant supervisor with experience managing large teams under stressful conditions. She had organized about 30 people into a functioning survival community, and she was looking for assistance with security and resource management. Sarah's group had taken over an elementary school building that was structurally sound and had some residual heating capacity. They had pooled their resources, established work assignments, and created a decision-making process that kept everyone involved while maintaining operational efficiency. Most importantly, they had developed a sustainable plan for acquiring food, water, and medical supplies without relying on government assistance or taking resources from other survivor groups. Working with Sarah's group taught me that civilian leadership could be more effective than police authority in this new environment. She understood how to motivate people without using the threat of legal consequences. She knew how to resolve conflicts through negotiation and compromise rather than enforcement of regulations. Her approach to resource allocation was based on fairness and necessity rather than adherence to property rights that no longer had any practical meaning. But Sarah also understood the importance of security in ways that challenged my assumptions about the role of armed personnel in community survival. She didn't want us to act as traditional police officers, enforcing rules and investigating crimes. She wanted us to serve as protectors and trainers, helping community members develop the skills they needed to defend themselves and their resources. The distinction was significant because it required us to think about violence as a tool for community defense rather than law enforcement. The experience of working with organized civilians also revealed how much my police training had been shaped by the assumption that government authority was legitimate and effective. I'd been taught to approach every situation from the perspective of enforcing laws and maintaining order on behalf of a functioning legal system. But when that system no longer existed, those approaches became counterproductive. People needed protection and leadership, but they didn't need someone trying to arrest them for violations of regulations that had become meaningless. Day 15 brought news that confirmed our worst fears about the scope of the disaster. Sarah's group had been monitoring shortwave radio communications from around the country, and they were hearing reports of similar conditions from regions that should have been unaffected by the atmospheric changes. Cities as far south as Atlanta and New Orleans were reporting unprecedented temperature drops, infrastructure failures, and breakdowns of government services. But more concerning were the reports from international shortwave operators describing similar conditions in Europe, Asia, and other continents. The volcanic eruption in the mid-Atlantic ridge had apparently triggered atmospheric changes that were affecting global weather patterns much more severely than anyone had predicted. This wasn't a regional disaster that could be managed through evacuation and temporary relocation. This was a planetary emergency that was challenging the survival of human civilization everywhere. The international communications also included references to government contingency plans that suggested major world powers had been preparing for this kind of catastrophe for years. Emergency protocols, resource stockpiles, and survival facilities. That seemed too extensive to have been developed in response to the current crisis. The possibility that governments had been anticipating this kind of environmental collapse, but had chosen not to warn their populations, was deeply disturbing. Sarah's group had also been in contact with other survivor communities through amateur radio networks, and the reports from these groups painted a picture of widespread social collapse and resource competition. Communities that had initially tried to maintain normal social structures were breaking apart due to conflicts over food, heating, fuel, and shelter. Groups that had organized around strong leadership and clear survival priorities were more likely to maintain cohesion, but they were also more likely to come into conflict with other communities over access to resources. The radio communications revealed that some survivor groups were becoming increasingly militaristic, using violence to take resources from weaker communities and defend their territory against outsiders. The breakdown of law enforcement and government services was creating a situation where the most aggressive and well-armed groups were becoming dominant, while communities that tried to maintain civilized behavior were being victimized by those who were willing to do whatever was necessary to survive. Day 16 brought our first direct encounter with a hostile survivor group. While we were helping Sarah's community establish a secure perimeter around their school building, we were approached by a group of armed men who demanded that we turn over our weapons and tactical equipment. They claimed to represent a larger organization that was establishing control over the entire metropolitan area, and they said that all resources needed to be pooled under their management for the common good. The leader of this group was someone I recognized from previous police encounters, a career criminal named Marcus Williams who had been involved in drug trafficking and weapons violations before the environmental crisis. He was using the collapse of law enforcement as an opportunity to establish himself as a warlord, collecting tribute from weaker groups and eliminating anyone who challenged his authority. His rhetoric about common good and resource sharing was just a cover for organized theft and intimidation. The confrontation with Williams's group forced us to make a decision about how we would use our tactical training in this new world. We could try to maintain our identity as law enforcement officers, which would mean attempting to arrest criminals and preserve some semblance of legal order. But we had no way to process arrests, no functioning court system, and no detention facilities. Alternatively, we could act as military defenders of the communities we were trying to protect, which would mean using lethal force to eliminate threats without regard for legal procedures. I chose to treat Williams's group as a military threat rather than a law enforcement problem. We used our tactical training to establish defensive positions, coordinated our response through hand signals and radio communication, and made it clear that we were prepared to use lethal force to protect the people under our protection. The encounter ended without violence, but only because Williams's group was not prepared for organized resistance from people with military-style training and equipment. The aftermath of the confrontation revealed how much our role had changed. Since the collapse of normal government services, Sarah's community looked to us for protection and leadership in ways that went far beyond traditional police work. They wanted us to make decisions about resource allocation, community security, and survival strategies that were normally handled by elected officials and civilian administrators. We were becoming the government of a small survivor community, not just the law enforcement arm of a larger political system. Day 17 brought a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about the government's response to the crisis. While searching an abandoned federal building for supplies, we found documents that had been left behind when government personnel evacuated the facility. The documents revealed that federal agencies had been planning for this kind of environmental catastrophe for over a decade, and that the initial response strategies had been designed to preserve government continuity rather than protect the general population. According to the documents, something called the National Continuity Plan had been activated within hours of the volcanic eruption, and key government personnel had been relocated to secure facilities in southern regions before the public had been informed about the severity of the situation. The plan included provisions for abandoning northern cities, relocating essential government functions, and establishing temporary settlements for selected populations. But the majority of citizens in affected areas were essentially being written off as acceptable losses. The documents also revealed that the scientific data predicting long-term environmental changes had been available much earlier than government officials had publicly acknowledged. Computer models had shown that the volcanic ash would cause global temperature drops lasting several years, and that agricultural production would be severely disrupted throughout the northern hemisphere. Government agencies had known that millions of people would die from starvation and exposure, but they had chosen to focus their resources on preserving the infrastructure needed to rebuild civilization after the crisis passed. Reading those documents was like discovering that everything we'd been told about the disaster was a lie. The government hadn't been caught off guard by unexpected environmental changes. They had been implementing predetermined plans for managing the catastrophe they had been preparing for years. The reassuring statements about temporary disruptions and recovery timelines had been deliberate deceptions, designed to prevent panic while they completed their own evacuation procedures. But the most disturbing revelation was that local law enforcement and emergency services had been deliberately kept uninformed about the true scope of the crisis. Police departments, fire departments, and emergency medical services had been encouraged to maintain normal operations and continue serving their communities, even though federal officials knew that these efforts were futile. We had been sacrificing our lives to maintain order in communities that the government had already decided to abandon. The realization that we had been betrayed by our own government was devastating, but it also clarified our situation in ways that were oddly liberating. We were no longer law enforcement officers serving a legitimate government. We were survivors with useful skills and equipment, trying to help communities adapt to a world that no longer resembled the civilization we had sworn to protect. The badges and uniforms we wore were symbols of a dead system, but the training and experience we had gained could still be valuable for the right purposes. Day 18 marked the beginning of what I now think of as our transformation from police officers to community defenders. Sarah's group had grown to over 50 people, and they were attracting attention from other survivor communities, as well as hostile groups like the one led by Marcus Williams. The school building was becoming overcrowded, and we needed to establish additional secure facilities while maintaining the security of our primary location. The expansion required us to think strategically about territory, resource control, and population management in ways that had nothing to do with traditional law enforcement. We were essentially establishing the foundations of a new society, and the decisions we made about governance, resource allocation, And community defense would determine whether our group survived or became another casualty of the environmental collapse. But we were also learning that survival required compromises that challenged everything we thought we knew about justice and morality. When resources are limited and the environment is hostile, the ethical frameworks that guide behavior in normal circumstances become luxuries that can get people killed. We were having to make decisions about who deserved protection, who had access to resources, and who posed enough of a threat to justify lethal force. These weren't law enforcement decisions. These were wartime decisions made by people who were fighting for their lives and the lives of people they cared about. The documents we had found in the federal building also included references to other government installations and resource stockpiles that might still be accessible. If we could locate and secure these resources, we might be able to provide our community with the supplies needed to survive the long-term environmental changes. But accessing these resources would require military-style operations against facilities that might be defended by other survivor groups or automated security systems. The prospect of conducting raids against government facilities marked the final break from our identity as law enforcement officers. We were no longer trying to preserve the existing system or serve the interests of legitimate authority. We were preparing to take whatever resources we needed to keep our people alive, regardless of legal ownership or official authorization. We had become revolutionaries fighting against a government that had abandoned us, and our tactical training was about to be used for purposes that would have been unthinkable just 3 weeks earlier. Everything we thought we knew about duty, loyalty, and service had been turned upside down by the discovery that our own government had been planning to sacrifice us from the very beginning. The Ice Age had changed more than the weather. It had changed what it meant to be human in a world where the old rules no longer applied. Day 19 brought the first real test of our new role as community defenders rather than law enforcement officers. Sarah's group had successfully established a secure perimeter around the elementary school, but we were receiving reports from our radio network about a larger survivor community about 10 miles south that was under attack by Marcus Williams and his expanding organization. The community was requesting assistance, and Sarah was asking us to make a decision about whether we would help other groups or focus entirely on protecting our own people. The request forced us to confront fundamental questions about our responsibilities in this new world. As police officers, we had been trained to respond to calls for help regardless of personal risk or resource limitations. The idea that someone was in danger and we might choose not to help was contrary to everything we believed about our duty to protect and serve. But as community defenders operating with limited resources in a hostile environment, every decision had to be evaluated based on whether it improved or threatened the survival chances of the people depending on us for protection. Martinez argued that we couldn't ignore requests for help from other survivor communities because our own long-term survival depended on building alliances with groups that shared our values and approach to community organization. If we allowed aggressive groups like Williams's organization to eliminate peaceful communities one by one, we would eventually face them alone with no allies and no support network. The decision to help others wasn't just about moral obligation. It was strategic thinking about how to create conditions that would allow civilized communities to survive and eventually rebuild some form of organized society. Rodriguez disagreed, pointing out that we had barely enough resources to protect our own community and that military operations against hostile groups would inevitably result in casualties among our limited personnel. Every person we lost to external conflicts was someone who wouldn't be available to defend our primary location, gather resources, or provide essential services to our community members. Our first responsibility was to the people who had trusted us with their safety. And we couldn't fulfill that responsibility if we scattered our forces trying to help every group that requested assistance. Johnson raised a different concern about the long-term implications of engaging in armed conflict with other survivor groups. Once we crossed the line from defensive operations to offensive military action, we would be fundamentally changing the nature of our organization and our relationship with the broader survivor community. Other groups would start viewing us as a potential threat rather than a potential ally, and we might find ourselves drawn into an escalating cycle of violence that would consume resources and energy we needed for basic survival tasks. The debate continued for several hours, but ultimately Sarah made the decision that we would provide assistance to the community under attack. Her reasoning was that allowing aggressive groups to expand unchallenged would eventually threaten everyone in the region, and that early intervention was more likely to be successful than waiting until hostile organizations became too powerful to resist. She also pointed out that successful military operations could provide our community with additional resources and personnel, while demonstrating to other groups that we were capable of defending our allies. The decision to conduct our first offensive operation marked a turning point in our transformation from law enforcement officers to military defenders. We spent the rest of the day planning a tactical response that would neutralize Williams's group, while minimizing casualties among the community they were attacking. The planning process was familiar from our SWAT training, but the context was completely different. We weren't serving warrants or rescuing hostages on behalf of a legitimate government. We were conducting military operations against enemy forces in defense of allied communities. Day 20 brought our first combat operation in the New World. Williams's organization had approximately 20 armed members attacking the survivor community of about 40 people who had taken shelter in a shopping mall. The attackers were using the threat of violence to force the community to surrender their food supplies, medical equipment, and winter clothing. According to radio communications from the community, Williams's people had already killed 2 people who had tried to resist their demands. We approached the situation using standard SWAT tactics for hostage rescue, but adapted for the reality that we had no backup available and no medical support if the operation went wrong. Our objective was to eliminate the immediate threat to the community, while capturing resources and intelligence that would help us understand the scope and organization of Williams's expanding operation. We also needed to send a message to other aggressive groups that attacking peaceful communities would result in serious consequences. The tactical operation was successful in the sense that we neutralized Williams's attack force and rescued the community had been threatening. But the experience was fundamentally different from anything we had done as police officers. We weren't arresting criminals who would face trial in a court system. We were killing enemy combatants who posed an ongoing threat to community survival. The legal and moral frameworks that had guided our use of force as law enforcement officers were no longer relevant. During the operation, we discovered that Williams's organization was larger and better organized than we had initially understood. According to intelligence we gathered from captured communications equipment, they had established control over a significant area of the metropolitan region and were systematically raiding smaller communities for resources and personnel. They had also been in contact with similar organizations in other cities, suggesting that the breakdown of government authority was creating opportunities for organized criminal groups to establish territorial control on a regional scale. But more disturbing was evidence that Williams's group had been receiving information about government resource stockpiles and abandoned facilities from sources that appeared to have inside knowledge of federal contingency plans. They knew locations of supply caches, weapons storage facilities, and communication centers that weren't publicly known. Someone with access to classified information was providing intelligence to criminal organizations, possibly in exchange for resources or protection. The rescued community provided additional information about the changing dynamics among survivor groups in the region. According to their reports, communities that tried to maintain peaceful relationships and democratic decision-making processes were increasingly being victimized by more aggressive and militaristic organizations. The environmental crisis was creating selection pressure that favored groups willing to use violence to acquire resources, while communities that tried to preserve civilized behavior were being eliminated or absorbed by more ruthless competitors. Day 21 brought news that confirmed our worst fears about the scope of the social collapse we were witnessing. Radio communications from other regions indicated that similar patterns were developing throughout the areas affected by the environmental crisis. Local governments were collapsing, law enforcement agencies were disbanding, and military-style organizations were emerging to fill the power vacuum. The breakdown of civilization wasn't limited to our region. It was happening everywhere that the Ice Age was creating conditions too severe for normal social institutions to function. But the radio reports also included information about communities that were successfully adapting to the new conditions through different organizational approaches. Some groups were organizing around religious or ideological leadership that provided strong social cohesion. Others were focusing on technical expertise and resource management to create sustainable survival systems. A few were developing trade networks with other communities to share resources and information. The key factor that determined success seemed to be the ability to abandon old assumptions about how society should function and develop new approaches based on the realities of survival in a hostile environment. Sarah's community was growing rapidly as people from failed groups sought protection and organization. We now had over 70 people, including several individuals with valuable skills in medical care, mechanical repair, and food production. But the rapid growth was creating challenges for resource management, security, and decision-making that we weren't prepared to handle. The elementary school building was overcrowded, and we needed to establish additional facilities while maintaining security for our expanded population. The expansion also created new vulnerabilities that hostile groups could exploit. A larger community required more resources, which meant more extensive foraging operations and greater exposure to potential attacks. More people meant more opportunities for infiltration by enemy agents or conflicts between community members with different survival priorities. Most significantly, our success was attracting attention from larger and more powerful organizations that viewed our resources and personnel as valuable targets. Martinez had been monitoring communications from federal agencies that suggested government forces were beginning to establish secured zones in southern regions where environmental conditions were more manageable. According to these reports, federal authorities were consolidating control over areas with functioning infrastructure and favorable climate conditions while writing off northern regions as non-recoverable. But the communications also indicated that government forces would eventually conduct operations in abandoned areas to recover valuable resources and eliminate potential threats to their secured zones. The prospect of eventual conflict with federal forces was deeply troubling because it suggested that our community's long-term survival might depend on our ability to resist the same government we had once served. The environmental crisis had created a situation where former law enforcement officers were preparing to fight against federal authorities, who viewed survivor communities as threats to be eliminated rather than citizens to be protected. The transformation from protectors of government authority to enemies of that same authority was complete. Day 22 brought a personal crisis that forced me to confront the full implications of our new reality. Johnson received a message through the amateur radio network from his sister in Atlanta, who reported that conditions in the South were deteriorating faster than government officials were admitting. Federal authorities were establishing refugee camps for displaced populations, but the camps were overcrowded, undersupplied, and essentially functioning as detention facilities for people who were viewed as potential security threats. According to Johnson's sister, people in the refugee camps were being classified based on their potential usefulness to government continuity operations. Individuals with technical skills, military experience, or specialized knowledge were being relocated to secure facilities where they would support government survival operations. Everyone else was being housed in temporary settlements with minimal resources and no prospect of long-term support. The federal government was implementing a triage system that prioritized the survival of useful individuals while abandoning the majority of displaced citizens. But the most disturbing information was that federal authorities were actively preventing people from leaving the refugee camps and establishing independent communities. Anyone who attempted to organize alternative survival strategies was being detained as a potential threat to government operations. The camps were essentially becoming prisons for people whose only crime was being displaced by an environmental disaster that the government had failed to prevent or adequately respond to. The news from Atlanta forced us to acknowledge that the choice we had made to establish an independent community might eventually put us in direct conflict with federal authorities who viewed autonomous survivor groups as threats to their control over post-disaster resources and populations. We weren't just defending ourselves against criminal organizations like Williams's group. We were potentially preparing to resist government forces that had concluded that independent communities posed unacceptable challenges to their authority. That evening, Sarah called a community meeting to discuss our long-term survival strategy and the growing threats we were facing from both criminal organizations and potentially hostile government forces. The meeting revealed deep divisions within our community about how we should respond to the changing political and military situation. Some members argued that we should try to establish contact with federal authorities and negotiate some form of accommodation that would allow us to maintain our community while acknowledging government authority. Others believed that any contact with federal forces would result in our community being disbanded and our members being processed through the refugee camp system that was essentially functioning as a means of government control over displaced populations. They argued that our only chance for long-term survival was to maintain complete independence and prepare for eventual armed resistance against any group that threatened our autonomy, including government forces. The debate continued late into the night, but no consensus emerged about how we should balance the need for community security against the risks of attracting government attention. Sarah eventually decided that we would continue developing our defensive capabilities while avoiding any actions that might provoke direct confrontation with federal authorities. But she also made it clear that we would not surrender our independence or submit to government control over our community survival decisions. Day 23 brought evidence that our community's success was attracting unwanted attention from larger and more dangerous organizations. Radio intercepts revealed that multiple criminal groups were coordinating their activities and sharing intelligence about successful survivor communities that could be targeted for resources and personnel. Our recent military success against Williams's attack force had demonstrated that we possessed valuable tactical capabilities, but it had also identified us as a significant threat that needed to be eliminated or neutralized. The intelligence report suggested that we were facing a coordinated campaign by multiple criminal organizations that were working together to eliminate independent communities and establish territorial control over the entire metropolitan region. The criminal groups had apparently concluded that autonomous communities posed long-term threats to their authority and needed to be destroyed before they became too powerful to overcome. We were no longer dealing with random attacks by desperate survivors. We were facing organized military operations by groups that had strategic objectives and the resources to achieve them. But the radio intercepts also revealed that some criminal organizations were receiving support from sources that appeared to have access to government resources and intelligence. References to federal equipment, classified information about survivor community locations, and coordination with unidentified official personnel suggested that elements within the government were actively supporting criminal groups as a means of eliminating independent communities without direct federal intervention. The possibility that government agencies were using criminal organizations as proxy forces to eliminate survivor communities was deeply disturbing because it suggested a level of coordination and planning that went far beyond simple resource competition. If federal authorities were deliberately supporting criminal groups, then the apparent breakdown of law and order might actually be a controlled demolition of civil society, designed to eliminate potential challenges to government authority in the post-disaster environment. Sarah's response to the intelligence about coordinated criminal operations was to accelerate our preparations for sustained military conflict, while seeking alliances with other independent communities that shared our commitment to autonomous survival. She believed that isolated communities would be vulnerable to elimination by superior forces, but that a network of allied communities could provide mutual support and create conditions that would make it prohibitively expensive for criminal organizations to establish territorial control. The alliance strategy required us to expand our radio communication capabilities and establish secure channels for coordinating defensive operations with other communities. We also needed to develop protocols for sharing resources, personnel, and intelligence that would allow allied communities to support each other during attacks while maintaining their individual autonomy and decision-making authority. Day 24 brought the first test of our alliance strategy when a community about 15 miles east requested immediate assistance against a coordinated attack by multiple criminal groups. The attack involved approximately 50 armed attackers, using military-style tactics and equipment that suggested significant organizational capabilities and external support. The community under attack had about 30 defenders, but lacked the tactical training and heavy weapons needed to resist a sustained assault by superior forces. The request for assistance created a difficult strategic decision because responding would require us to deploy most of our available military personnel for an extended operation, leaving our own community vulnerable to attack while our forces were engaged elsewhere. But refusing to help would undermine the alliance strategy and potentially result in the loss of a valuable ally that could provide support during future conflicts. Sarah decided that we would respond to the request for assistance, but with modifications to our standard tactical approach that would minimize our exposure to casualties and allow us to withdraw quickly if the situation became untenable. We would provide precision support that would disrupt the attackers' coordination and allow the defending community to maintain their position, but we would not commit to a prolonged engagement that could result in significant losses among our limited personnel. The operation was successful in the sense that we prevented the destruction of an allied community and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated defensive operations between independent survivor groups. But the experience also revealed the sophistication and resources of the criminal organizations we were facing. The attackers had military-grade communications equipment, coordinated tactical formations, and access to heavy weapons that suggested they were receiving support from sources with access to government or military resources. During the operation, we captured intelligence that confirmed our worst fears about the scope of the organized campaign against independent communities. The criminal groups were operating under a unified command structure that was coordinating attacks across the entire region with the objective of eliminating all autonomous survivor communities within 60 days. The campaign was being supported by detailed intelligence about community locations, defensive capabilities, and resource stockpiles that could only have come from government sources. Day 25 marked the beginning of what we started calling the siege phase of our survival experience. Intelligence reports indicated that criminal organizations were preparing for a major offensive against our community and our allies that would involve coordinated attacks by over 200 armed personnel using military tactics and equipment. The offensive was apparently designed to eliminate the network of independent communities that had been providing mutual support and establishing an alternative to both criminal and government control. The intelligence also revealed that the offensive was being coordinated with federal authorities who would move in to establish government control over the region once the independent communities had been eliminated. The criminal organizations were essentially functioning as mercenary forces that would clear the area of potential resistance before official government forces arrived to impose federal authority. The entire campaign was designed to eliminate any possibility of autonomous survival and ensure that all remaining populations would be subject to government control. The prospect of facing a coordinated offensive by superior forces supported by government resources forced us to make fundamental decisions about our community's survival strategy. We could attempt to negotiate some form of surrender that might allow some of our members to survive in government custody, but that would mean abandoning our independence and submitting to the same control system that had betrayed us. Alternatively, we could prepare for sustained resistance that would likely result in significant casualties, but might allow us to maintain our autonomy if we could survive the initial assault. Sarah's decision was that we would resist any attempt to destroy our community or force us to submit to external control, regardless of the source of that threat or the odds of successful resistance. She argued that the government had forfeited any claim to legitimacy when they abandoned their responsibility to protect citizens and began supporting criminal organizations against survivor communities. Our obligation was to protect the people who had trusted us with their safety, and that meant fighting anyone who threatened their survival and freedom. The preparation for sustained resistance required us to transform our community from a survival organization into a military force capable of conducting defensive operations against superior numbers and equipment. We established defensive positions throughout our territory, created supply caches that would allow us to continue fighting even if our primary facilities were overrun, and developed contingency plans for evacuating non-combatants if the military situation became hopeless. But we also began planning offensive operations that would disrupt the criminal organizations' preparations and reduce their capability to conduct coordinated attacks against our community and our allies. The decision to transition from defensive to offensive operations marked the final transformation from law enforcement officers trying to maintain order into military commanders, fighting for the survival of our people against enemies that included the government we had once served. The documents we had found in the federal building contained references to other government installations that might contain resources we could use to improve our defensive capabilities. But accessing those resources would require military operations against facilities that might be defended by automated systems or hostile forces. The prospect of conducting raids against government installations marked the complete reversal of our relationship with federal authority. Day 26 brought news that would change everything. We thought we knew about our situation and our chances for long-term survival. Sarah had established contact with a group of former federal employees who had been involved in the early stages of Operation Deep Freeze before deciding to abandon their government positions and establish independent communities. According to their reports, the government's post-disaster strategy was far more extensive and systematic than we had understood. The federal authorities weren't just abandoning northern regions and consolidating control in southern areas. They were implementing a comprehensive plan for rebuilding American society under a completely different political and economic system that would prevent the kind of independence and local autonomy that had characterized pre-disaster communities. The environmental crisis was being used as an opportunity to eliminate democratic institutions and establish centralized control over all aspects of post-disaster society. According to the former federal employees, the refugee camps in southern regions were essentially functioning as processing centers where displaced populations were being evaluated, classified, and assigned roles in the new social system. People with useful skills were being relocated to secured facilities where they would support government operations under strict supervision. Everyone else was being housed in permanent settlements where they would be completely dependent on government resources and subject to government control over every aspect of their daily lives. But the most disturbing revelation was that the government had been planning this transformation for years before the environmental crisis occurred. Operation Deep Freeze wasn't an emergency response to an unexpected disaster. It was the implementation of predetermined plans for using a major crisis as an opportunity to eliminate democratic institutions and establish the kind of centralized control that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The environmental disaster had provided the justification they needed to implement changes that had been prepared long in advance. The realization that the collapse of democratic government wasn't an unfortunate consequence of the environmental crisis, but rather the intended result of predetermined government plans changed everything about our situation. We weren't just fighting for survival against criminal organizations and hostile environmental conditions. We were fighting to preserve the possibility of democratic self-governance against a government that was using the disaster as an opportunity to establish permanent authoritarian control over American society. The former federal employees also provided intelligence about government plans for dealing with independent survivor communities that refused to submit to federal authority. According to their information, communities like ours were classified as terrorist organizations that pose threats to national security and would be eliminated through military operations disguised as law enforcement actions against criminal groups. The government was planning to use the same criminal organizations they were supporting to justify military intervention against any community that maintained independence. Day 27 brought the discovery that would define our community's future and our understanding of what we were really fighting for. While conducting a reconnaissance operation near a government facility mentioned in the federal documents, we discovered a massive supply depot that contained enough resources to support our community for years. But the depot was also being used as a staging area for the coordinated offensive against independent communities, and accessing it would require a major military operation against well-defended positions. The supply depot contained everything we needed for long-term survival, including medical supplies, food reserves, weapons, ammunition, and communication equipment. But it also contained evidence of the scope and systematic nature of the government's campaign against independent communities. Intelligence reports, operational plans, and coordination documents that revealed the full extent of federal involvement in what we had been interpreting as criminal activity. The decision to attack the supply depot would mark the point of no return in our conflict with federal authority. Once we conducted military operations against government facilities, we would be definitively classified as enemies of the state rather than displaced citizens seeking survival. But the resources in the depot might provide our community and our allies with the means to survive the coordinated offensive and establish the foundation for long-term resistance against government attempts to eliminate independent communities. Sarah's decision was that we would conduct the operation against the supply depot, not just to acquire the resources we needed for survival, but to demonstrate that independent communities were capable of successful resistance against government forces. She believed that the only way to preserve the possibility of democratic self-governance was to prove that autonomous communities could survive and thrive despite government attempts to eliminate them. The preparation for the operation against the government supply depot required us to coordinate with all of our allied communities and commit virtually all of our military resources to a single high-risk operation. Success would provide us with the means to resist the coordinated offensive and potentially inspire other communities to maintain their independence. Failure would result in the destruction of our community and the elimination of organized resistance to government control in our region. But the intelligence we had gathered about government plans also suggested that this might be our last opportunity to acquire the resources needed for long-term resistance. Once the coordinated offensive began, independent communities would be fighting for immediate survival rather than long-term strategic objectives. The supply depot operation was our chance to change the balance of power before the final phase of the conflict began. Everything we had learned about survival, leadership, and resistance during the previous month had prepared us for this moment, when we would have to risk everything to preserve the possibility of freedom in a world where government authority had become indistinguishable from tyranny. Day 28 brought the moment of truth that would determine whether our community would survive as a free and independent group or be destroyed by the coordinated offensive that intelligence reports indicated would begin within 48 hours. The operation against the government supply depot required perfect coordination between our community and 3 allied groups, with timing that would allow us to secure the resources and withdraw before federal reinforcements could arrive. To defend the facility, the depot was located in a former National Guard armory that had been repurposed as a staging area for the campaign against independent communities. According to reconnaissance reports from our allies, the facility contained enough medical supplies, food reserves, weapons, and ammunition to support several hundred people for multiple years. But it was also defended by approximately 30 federal personnel and automated security systems that would make the operation extremely dangerous, even with surprise and superior numbers. Sarah's operational plan required us to coordinate simultaneous attacks on multiple government facilities to prevent federal forces from concentrating their defenses at the supply depot. While our primary force attacked the armory, allied communities would conduct diversionary operations against communication centers and transportation hubs that would disrupt government coordination and delay reinforcement of the depot. The success of the entire operation depended on precise timing and flawless execution by communities that had never conducted coordinated military operations before. The night before the operation, I found myself thinking about how completely our situation had changed since that first morning when volcanic ash began falling on Detroit. We had started as police officers trying to maintain order during what we thought was a temporary emergency. Now we were military commanders preparing to conduct offensive operations against the same government we had once served. The transformation had been gradual but irreversible, driven by discoveries about government betrayal and the necessity of defending our community against systematic attempts to eliminate our independence. But I also understood that the operation we were about to conduct would fundamentally change the nature of our conflict with federal authority. Once we attacked government installations and killed federal personnel, we would be definitively classified as terrorists rather than displaced citizens. There would be no possibility of negotiation or accommodation with government forces. We would be committed to sustained resistance until either we were eliminated or the government abandoned its attempts to control survivor communities. Day 29 began at 4 o'clock in the morning with final preparations for the most complex military operation our community had ever attempted. The coordinated attack required us to deploy virtually all of our combat-capable personnel while leaving our primary facility defended by civilians with minimal tactical training. If the operation failed, or if we were detected before completing our objectives, our community would be vulnerable to immediate retaliation by government forces or criminal organizations working under government direction. The approach to the armory required a 6-mile movement through territory that was potentially under government surveillance, using routes that would avoid detection while allowing rapid withdrawal if the operation was compromised. Our tactical formation included personnel from all 4 allied communities, creating coordination challenges that we had never faced before. We were essentially conducting a joint military operation with forces that had different training, equipment, and communication procedures. The initial phase of the operation proceeded according to plan, with our diversionary attacks successfully disrupting government communications and drawing federal attention away from the supply depot. Radio intercepts indicated that federal forces were responding to multiple simultaneous attacks and requesting reinforcements from regional command centers. The confusion created by coordinated operations across multiple locations was preventing government forces from organizing effective responses to any single attack. But as we approached the armory perimeter, reconnaissance reports revealed that the facility's defenses were more extensive than our intelligence had indicated. In addition to the federal personnel we had expected, the depot was being defended by members of Williams's criminal organization who were apparently working directly with government forces. The discovery that criminal groups were functioning as auxiliary forces for federal operations confirmed our worst fears about the scope of government cooperation with hostile organizations. The presence of criminal personnel at the government facility also indicated that our operation had been anticipated and that federal forces were prepared for our attack. Either our communications had been intercepted or one of our allied communities had been infiltrated by government agents. The possibility that we were walking into a trap forced us to make immediate tactical adjustments while continuing with an operation that our community's survival depended on completing successfully. Martinez suggested that we abort the operation and withdraw before we could be trapped by superior forces, but Sarah's analysis was that withdrawal would only delay our inevitable confrontation with federal forces while allowing them to complete their preparations for the coordinated offensive against independent communities. Our intelligence indicated that the offensive would begin regardless of whether we conducted this operation, and the resources in the depot might provide our only chance of surviving the systematic campaign to eliminate autonomous communities. The tactical assault on the armory began at 7:30 in the morning with coordinated attacks on multiple entry points that would prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces at any single location. Our SWAT training was invaluable for conducting room-by-room clearing operations, but the context was completely different from anything we had experienced as law enforcement officers. We were fighting federal personnel and criminal auxiliaries who were defending government resources that we needed for our community's survival. The intensity of the resistance we encountered confirmed that the federal forces had been prepared for our attack and were fighting with the determination of people who understood the strategic importance of the facility. But the criminal auxiliaries were less disciplined than the federal personnel, and their presence actually created tactical vulnerabilities that we were able to exploit using coordination techniques we had developed during our law enforcement careers. During the assault, we discovered that the supply depot contained far more resources than our reconnaissance had indicated, including communications equipment that would allow us to monitor government operations and weapons systems that would significantly improve our defensive capabilities. But we also found evidence that the depot was one of several similar facilities that were supporting the coordinated campaign against independent communities, and that our operation would only temporarily disrupt government preparations for the offensive. The most significant discovery was a complete set of operational plans for the campaign against independent communities, including detailed intelligence about our community and our allies that could only have come from systematic surveillance operations. The government had been monitoring our communications, tracking our personnel, and analyzing our capabilities for weeks before we became aware of their hostile intentions. Our every move had been observed and recorded by federal intelligence operations. But the operational plans also revealed vulnerabilities in the government strategy that we could potentially exploit to disrupt their campaign. The coordination between federal forces and criminal auxiliaries created communication challenges and command structure problems that could be exploited by communities with superior tactical training and coordination. The government's reliance on criminal organizations also created political vulnerabilities if evidence of their cooperation became public knowledge. The withdrawal from the supply depot was complicated by the arrival of federal reinforcements. who had been redirected from responding to our diversionary attacks. The government forces were attempting to surround the facility and trap our assault force inside the armory. But our allied communities conducted additional diversionary operations that drew federal attention away from the depot and allowed us to complete our withdrawal with minimal casualties. Day 30 brought the aftermath of our successful operation against the government supply depot and the realization that we had fundamentally changed our situation through decisive military action. The resources we had captured would allow our community to survive the coordinated offensive and potentially support sustained resistance against government attempts to eliminate independent communities. But the operation had also confirmed that we were facing systematic government efforts to destroy autonomous survivor groups and establish complete federal control over post-disaster society. The intelligence we had captured revealed that the coordinated offensive against independent communities was scheduled to begin within 72 hours and would involve federal forces working directly with criminal organizations to eliminate all autonomous groups in the region. The operation was designed to appear as law enforcement action against criminal organizations, while actually targeting communities that refused to submit to government control. Our successful raid had disrupted their preparations but had also confirmed their determination to eliminate independent communities. Sarah's analysis of the captured intelligence indicated that our community and our allies were facing a choice between immediate submission to federal authority or sustained military resistance against superior forces. The government had concluded that independent communities posed unacceptable threats to their post-disaster control strategy and were prepared to use overwhelming force to eliminate any group that maintained autonomy. There would be no negotiation or accommodation with communities that refused to surrender their independence. But the intelligence also revealed that our successful operation had inspired other communities throughout the region to begin preparing for resistance against government control. Radio communications indicated that dozens of independent groups were coordinating defensive preparations and sharing intelligence about government operations. The network of autonomous communities was larger and more extensive than either we or the government had realized, and our military success had demonstrated that resistance was possible. The prospect of regional resistance against government control created opportunities for strategic coordination that could make sustained independence viable for communities with adequate resources and tactical capabilities. If enough independent groups could maintain their autonomy and provide mutual support, they might be able to establish territories where democratic self-governance could survive despite government attempts to impose centralized control. Rodriguez pointed out that sustained resistance would require our community to function as a military organization indefinitely, with all the implications that had for community governance, resource allocation, and individual freedom. We would essentially be establishing a society organized around permanent military preparedness, which might preserve our independence from government control, but would also limit our ability to develop the kind of democratic institutions we were fighting to protect. The tension between military necessity and democratic values was something we would have to navigate carefully if we wanted to create communities that were worth defending. The challenge was maintaining our commitment to individual freedom and community self-governance while developing the military capabilities needed to resist government attempts to eliminate our independence. We needed to become strong enough to defend ourselves without becoming the kind of authoritarian organization we were fighting against. The final radio communication we received on day 30 confirmed that the coordinated offensive against independent communities had begun in other regions and was producing the results the government had anticipated. Communities that lacked adequate defensive preparations or tactical leadership were being quickly eliminated or forced to surrender. But communities with military capabilities and strategic coordination were successfully resisting government forces and maintaining their independence. Our 30-day transformation from law enforcement officers to community defenders had prepared us for the challenges we would face during the coming months and years of sustained resistance. We had learned that survival in the post-disaster world required abandoning assumptions about government legitimacy and developing new approaches to community organization based on the realities of environmental collapse and political authoritarianism. But we had also learned that protecting people doesn't always mean carrying a gun or enforcing laws. Sometimes it means carrying hope and helping communities develop the capabilities they need to maintain their independence and preserve their values despite overwhelming challenges. The Ice Age had changed more than the weather. It had changed what it meant to be human in a world where the old rules no longer applied. The government documents we had captured contained references to long-term planning for post-disaster society. That suggested the environmental crisis was expected to continue for years, and that government authorities were preparing to establish permanent changes to American political and social institutions. The Ice Age wasn't just a temporary emergency that would eventually end with a return to normal conditions. It was the beginning of a new era that would require completely different approaches to survival, governance, and community organization. Our community had proven that independent groups could survive and thrive despite government attempts to eliminate them. But we had also learned that sustained resistance would require continuous adaptation and evolution. The challenges we would face during the coming years would test every aspect of our commitment to freedom and self-governance. The 30 days had taught me that the world I knew was gone forever, but they had also taught me that people can change, adapt, and survive if they're willing to fight for what matters most. The Ice Age was just the beginning. The real test would be learning to live in the world it left behind, while preserving the values and institutions that make life worth living. We had become something new during those 30 days, something that had never existed before in American history. We were free communities in a world where freedom had become a revolutionary concept that had to be defended with force against a government that viewed independence as treason. Our transformation was complete, but our mission was just beginning.